When Augustus ruled the vast Roman Empire, one of his main concerns was maintaining control over every corner of his territories. For this purpose, periodic censuses were carried out that allowed knowing how many people lived in each province, how much tax could be collected, and what resources were available. In Judea, subjected to the authority of Rome, although locally governed by Herod the Great, these measures were also applied. Sometimes they were done in a strictly Roman way. Other times they were adapted to local customs. Therefore, it is not surprising that at some point close to the birth of Jesus, a census was announced that mobilized thousands of people. Joseph, a descendant of an ancient family linked to the lineage of David, heard the news like all the other inhabitants of Galilee. He lived in Nazareth, a small village where life revolved around the countryside, carpentry, and daily trades. There the houses were simple, the roads narrow, and the community knew each other. Mary, his wife, was expecting a child, and although the journey they had to undertake did not seem the most convenient, the census required Joseph to register in Bethlehem, the city of his ancestors. At that time, population movements for administrative reasons were not unusual. They could be inconvenient, but they were part of life under Roman rule. The road from Nazareth to Bethlehem was not short. About 120 kilometers separated both locations depending on the chosen route. The safest option consisted of descending towards the Jordan Valley, following the river line to avoid the central mountains of the country, and then ascending towards Jerusalem to finally reach Bethlehem, which was only a few kilometers to the south. Travelers usually moved in groups for safety, but this was not always possible. Some historians imagine Joseph and Mary walking alongside caravans. Others consider it likely that they traveled alone, stopping at improvised shelters and rural inns scattered along the way. The journey, in the conditions of the first century, could take between 5 and 7 days. The pace was not fast. People moved as they could while the sun accompanied them. During the day, the Jordan Valley offered a dry landscape with warm temperatures even in winter, and at night it was common to stop where there was water and shade. Mary, in an advanced state of pregnancy according to tradition, would have made the journey with additional difficulties, but there are no details about how the trip was organized. The classic image of a donkey accompanying her is part of later Christian tradition. The original account does not specify the means of transport. As they moved southward, the landscape changed slowly. Galilee was left behind with its gentle hills and cultivated fields. The Jordan Valley stretched like a natural corridor that connected the north with the desert. And then finally came the ascent towards Judea, a steep climb where the air became cooler and villages appeared one after another as they approached Jerusalem, the political and religious center of the region. That was a world where Roman authority was always present, vigilant, and where Jewish populations maintained a delicate balance between their ancestral identity and imperial demands. When Joseph and Mary reached Bethlehem, the village was fuller than usual. The census had forced many to temporarily return to their places of origin, and Bethlehem, although small, had special significance for those descended from the ancient family of David. The houses were modest, built with local stone, and many were distributed on 2 levels. Upstairs, the family lived; downstairs, the animals were kept. There were also annexes built as independent stables to shelter them in winter. In those secondary spaces, travelers who arrived late or when there was no room in the main rooms were often accommodated. The custom of the time dictated that any visitor be received, but there was not always enough space for everyone. Rooms intended for guests, called katalimata, could fill quickly during periods of high mobility. Joseph looked for lodging like any other pilgrim, but the available houses were already occupied. Therefore, those who received him offered the only free place, the area where the animals were kept warm and protected, although not designed to house a family. The arrival at that space marked the end of the journey, but it did not resolve the accumulated fatigue or the worry about the days to come. Even so, it was common that during census times the newcomers adapted to what they found. Life in Judea was accustomed to improvisation and hospitality within what was possible. The lower level of the house, or the small adjacent stable, offered sufficient shelter while the village continued to receive people. Bethlehem was not a large urban center. Whoever entered there found narrow streets, houses modestly lit by oil lamps, and families living from shepherding and agriculture. From the nearby fields, the sounds of animals could be heard. From the houses, voices of travelers seeking space. In that environment, Joseph and Mary settled as best they could. The birth in the manger, historical and cultural context of humble births. The night Mary gave birth took place in an environment very different from what any family of the time would have imagined. In Judea, births usually occurred inside the home, in a room where women from the surrounding area gathered to assist the mother. Small villages relied on experience passed down from generation to generation. Local midwives, neighbors, or relatives handled the process, while the rest of the house remained silent. But in Bethlehem, crowded with visitors because of the census, these customs could not be followed normally. The space Joseph and Mary were given was not a room prepared for childbirth. It was an area intended for animals, a common part of rural homes. Many houses in Bethlehem were built on 2 levels. On the upper level, the family slept. On the lower level, especially during cold nights, small livestock such as sheep, goats, and donkeys were kept. Other homes had a small attached stable made of stone and roofed with beams covered in hardened mud. There, straw, tools, and water containers were stored. Sometimes travelers without a temporary home were accommodated in these secondary spaces more out of necessity than comfort. The manger mentioned in the accounts was not an exceptional object. It was a feeder carved in stone or shaped from clay, sturdy and simple. Its presence immediately indicates the type of room where everything took place. Not a bedroom, not a common room, but a lower level of the house or a complementary stable. That manger would have been placed next to a wall or a stone pillar away from the entrance, where the night cold could seep through gaps in the wall. Bethlehem had no medical facilities. In Judea, there were no institutions for attending births outside the home. Most women gave birth assisted by other women from the surroundings. Mary, however, was far from Nazareth. No one knows if any inhabitant of Bethlehem assisted with the birth, or if Joseph had to prepare water, cloths, and a clean space within that improvised area. The original account does not mention any midwife, but historically it was rare for a birth to occur without at least one experienced woman nearby, except in forced circumstances such as a long journey. The manger, later a symbol of humility at that moment, would have been nothing more than a practical solution. Rural life used any available surface to accommodate a newborn in the first minutes. A blanket on the floor, the mother's lap, or in urgent cases, a firm container. The feeder offered stability and was at the right height to avoid direct contact with the cold ground. The lighting in that room would have been dim. Oil lamps made of clay or bronze projected a yellowish light that barely allowed objects to be distinguished at medium distance. The smell of animals permeated the air, mixed with dust and straw remnants. It was not an unhealthy environment, but it was filled with the sense of livestock common in homes of the time. In many houses, part of the family economy depended on these animals. Their presence near the inhabitants was not extraordinary. Meanwhile, the village remained active despite the hour. The narrow streets, made of packed earth, echoed with the steps of newcomers seeking lodging. In houses where guest rooms were already occupied, corners were improvised for entire families. The census, although ordered from afar, had tangible effects on these rural communities. Water containers filled, stored food ran out, and private space became smaller. For Joseph and Mary, recently arrived after a difficult journey, the only available option was a place normally used for animals and farm tools. The birth of a child in that environment would not have attracted attention in a village accustomed to improvisation. In the ancient world, the priority was to protect the mother and the baby from the elements. An enclosed space, however humble, offered more security than sleeping outdoors. The temperature inside the stable was usually warmer than outside, partly due to the body heat of the animals and partly because stone walls retained nighttime warmth better. The silence accompanying the moment of birth contrasted with the outside bustle. Joseph would have laid cloths over a cleared area, possibly cleaned minutes before, with the urgency allowed by the circumstances. Heated water in clay containers was used to wash the newborn, a practice documented in first-century Jewish domestic life. Then blankets and swaddles helped maintain the baby's body temperature. Nothing in local customs indicated that such a birth was unusual. Entire families lived in small spaces, shared rooms with livestock during winter, and relied on community cooperation. The exceptional thing was not the manger. The exceptional thing would be the story that this child would later play a part in. But at that moment, the event unfolded like any other rural birth, discreet, intimate, simple. Bethlehem's environment that night was conditioned by the movement of people. Some houses had more visitors than they could accommodate, others improvised spaces in inner courtyards or terraces. The lamplights mingled with the darkness of the streets, and the murmur of exhausted travelers spread from half-open doors. In a corner of one of those crowded homes, without the village noticing, another child had just been born. And as in so many humble births, the family had to adapt to what was available, not knowing how long their stay would last or what complications the census might bring in the days ahead. The theological significance of Bethlehem in the Messianic prophecy. When Joseph and Mary arrived in Bethlehem, the village was not merely a geographically relevant point because of the census. For the Jewish people of the first century, Bethlehem had a much deeper background. It was not an important city in administrative terms, nor a notable commercial center, but its name evoked ancient resonances and was linked to some of the most remembered figures of Israel. In the time of Jesus, any Jew familiar with the history of their people knew that Bethlehem was the cradle of King David, and this fact shaped the way the place was understood. The memory of David was central to Jewish identity. During his reign, Israel had achieved a unity and splendor that would not later be repeated with the same force. Bethlehem, his hometown, became a symbol of the lost ideal, a reference point evoking times of stability, leadership, and direct connection with God. Therefore, it is not surprising that in ancient texts it appeared as the setting for future hopes. One of the best-known prophecies spoke of a ruler who would emerge from there and have relevance for the fate of the people. It was not an explicit announcement of a Messiah as it would be understood centuries later, but it was an expectation linked to a figure of renewed authority who came from the same lineage. In the daily life of the first century, these prophetic connections were not theoretical. Jews lived under Roman occupation, with constant tensions, heavy tributes, and local authorities who responded more to the interests of the empire than to those of the population. Expectations of political and spiritual restoration were transmitted in synagogues, homes, and traditional stories. The idea of a future leader descended from David was not an isolated concept, but part of a collective imagination that remained alive even in the humblest sectors. Bethlehem, although small, carried that heritage. Those walking its stone streets might find nothing more than simple houses and pastures, but they knew they were treading on territory whose history traced back to crucial events. The figure of David was remembered in songs, festivals, and public readings. For many, the symbolic return to Bethlehem meant looking back at the roots of Israel at a time when the nation seemed to have a clear direction. This historical dimension coexisted with diverse interpretations of how the ancient prophecy should be understood. Some expected a military leader capable of expelling Rome, others imagined a spiritual renewer, others a just judge who would reorganize community life. There was no single vision of the type of figure who would emerge from the house of David, but there was general consensus about the importance of that lineage. The presence of so many families in Bethlehem during the census only reinforced these associations. Those who, like Joseph, came from that ancestry temporarily returned to the city where their family history had a point of origin, even if for many that link was remote and symbolic. Amid that movement, the birth of another child did not raise suspicions or expectations. However, the coincidence between a census forcing a return to the ancestral city and a birth occurring there fit with ancient references, placing Bethlehem as a significant setting. During those days, the village was full of descendants from families tracing back to ancient tribes. Each house, each street, each improvised stable was immersed in that mixture of history and present. Bethlehem did not live off past glories. It was a village of workers caring for sheep, cultivating olives, and trying to sustain their lives in uncertain times. Previous generations had associated Bethlehem with a glorious past. Contemporary generations saw it as a small village surviving under Roman rule. The two perceptions coexisted without conflict. Families registering for the census that year found in Bethlehem a place with ancestral significance, even if their stay was brief. They entered modest homes, settled as best they could, and then returned to their places of origin. That coming and going reinforced the connection between family histories and the identity of the people. Bethlehem, though small, was a constant reminder of a time when the nation had been independent. In the days immediately before and after the birth of Jesus, Bethlehem continued to carry that heritage. The village was not a center of political power, but its name remained associated with David and with ancient references mentioning a future ruler. What happened within its stone walls was absorbed by daily life, while the movement caused by the census continued filling streets and improvised homes. Thus, Bethlehem maintained its dual nature, a humble Judean village and at the same time a place inseparable from the historical memory of Israel. The Star of Bethlehem, astronomical, historical, and symbolic interpretations. While the days following the birth passed in Bethlehem, elsewhere in the ancient world a phenomenon arose that would later be associated with the narrative. A star that, according to tradition, caught the attention of wise men coming from the east. In antiquity, peoples observed the sky with a dedication that today seems unimaginable. Without telescopes or modern instruments, but with generations of accumulated observation, they were able to recognize patterns, record movements, and assign meaning to anything that broke the routine of the constellations. The appearance of a new light in the sky, whatever its nature, did not go unnoticed. Ancient records from different peoples, such as the Babylonians, Chinese, and Persians, describe shooting stars, comets, and planetary conjunctions interpreted as signs. For many Eastern sages trained in astronomy, mathematics, and the reading of omens, the sky functioned as a great archive where gods or destiny left traces. There are several hypotheses about what the star mentioned in the accounts could have been. One of the most widely suggested is a planetary conjunction, a visible approach between Jupiter and Saturn around 7 BC. For observers in the ancient world, Jupiter was associated with royalty, and Saturn had links to Israel in certain Mesopotamian astronomical traditions. The conjunction of the two would have been interpreted by some astronomers as an unusual event, worthy of attention. Another possibility is the appearance of a comet. Chinese records mention celestial bodies of this type during the years near the birth of Jesus. A comet crossing the sky would have been visible from a great distance and, because of its striking nature, could have provoked diverse interpretations among those tracking celestial movements. However, in many cultures, comets were seen as omens of misfortune, complicating their identification with a positive announcement. There is also the hypothesis of a nova or supernova, that is, a stellar explosion visible as a new light in the night sky. Astronomical records from the East document phenomena of this type in that era, although exact correlation with the historical calendar is difficult to establish. A nova would have shone for weeks or months, long enough for sages from distant regions to detect it and decide to undertake a journey following its apparent direction. In all these cases, the common element is the visual and symbolic impact that an astronomical phenomenon could have on societies dependent on the sky for organizing calendars, festivities, and political decisions. For many peoples, including first-century Judaism, celestial signs were part of the language used to interpret the course of history. Stars were part of a created order, and when something unusual appeared, it was considered worthy of study or reflection. The sages who, according to tradition, observed the star would have had advanced knowledge. In regions like Babylonia and Persia, astronomy was a consolidated discipline, inheriting centuries of systematic observation. Astronomers and priests in those territories received training in astronomical tables, mathematical calculations, and cultural symbolism connecting celestial events with earthly affairs. For them, a new light was not a mere natural phenomenon. It was a message within a complex system of meaning. The direction in which the star pointed would also have influenced its interpretation. The East had long trade and cultural routes connecting diverse kingdoms. Traveling westward to lands ruled by Herod and monitored by Rome was not an impulsive decision. If that celestial phenomenon truly motivated a journey, it must have been perceived as extraordinary within its cultural context. Meanwhile, in Judea, the local population lived in constant tension with Roman authority. Rumors of celestial signs could circulate quickly, mingling with messianic hopes and expectations that were part of the religious atmosphere. But Bethlehem, small and occupied with the census movement, would hardly have had immediate access to such sophisticated interpretations of the sky. News of astronomical phenomena usually came from regions with schools dedicated to their study. The star, whatever it was, gained relevance because it was observed by those who knew how to read the sky. For the rest of the population, especially in rural villages, many phenomena went unnoticed or received little attention. Daily life was marked by agricultural work, and only travelers or merchants brought news of distant events. In any case, this phenomenon, whether real or interpreted, became integrated into the historical narrative as an element connecting different regions and bodies of knowledge. It was not an isolated event, but one coinciding with other cultural practices of the era, tracking celestial signs, seeking meaning in the movements of the firmament, and the belief that major events in human history could correspond to what occurred in the sky. In the East, the sages who observed the star would not have acted impulsively. Long journeys required preparation, provisions, permits, safe routes. To undertake a trip westward, crossing deserts and cities controlled by various authorities, organization was needed. If they decided to make that journey, the phenomenon they observed must have seemed significant within the framework of their astronomical and cultural beliefs. The star, whatever its physical nature, thus became a starting point for a human movement connecting several regions of the ancient world. While Joseph and Mary adapted to their improvised accommodation in Bethlehem, a group of distant observers interpreted a signal they considered worthy of follow-up. Who the Magi really were, origin, ethnicities, and social function. Long before their figures became an inseparable part of Christmas iconography, the men that tradition would call the Magi belonged to a group very different from what the later world imagined. The word Magi did not refer to illusionists or sorcerers, but to a type of wise man originating from eastern regions, particularly associated with Persia and Babylonia. In those territories, the Magi were part of a class specialized in astronomy, interpretation of symbols, observation of the skies, and advisory roles in religious and political matters. Persian culture, especially under Zoroastrian influence, gave a prominent place to these sages. They were meticulous observers of the firmament and conservators of knowledge accumulated over generations. Their role was to interpret celestial signs, advise rulers, and maintain astronomical records that served both agricultural purposes and state decisions. Their role was respected and, at times, feared, as it was believed they understood the cosmos's design better than most. Tradition describes them traveling from the east, a broad indication that could encompass regions now corresponding to Iran, Iraq, or even areas beyond the Euphrates. At that time, these zones were centers of culture, trade, and study. Cities like Babylon, Seleucia, or Ecbatana hosted communities of scholars dedicated to observing the skies from towers or elevated terraces where they could record celestial movements with precision. Astronomy, far from being only a science, was also a way to interpret historical events. In these societies, reading the sky had practical implications. The movement of a planet could be associated with political decisions. The appearance of an unusual phenomenon could announce a change in a king's life. That is why, when the sages observed something they considered exceptional, their reaction was not merely curious. They decided to undertake a long journey westward, convinced that the celestial sign pointed to a significant event beyond their borders. The fact that they were described as Magi indicates not only their origin, but also their social status. They were not kings, at least not in the strict political sense. They were educated men belonging to an intellectual elite. They traveled with resources, possibly with assistants and pack animals, and were accustomed to moving among courts and cities. Their presence in Judea would have attracted attention, as they represented a world foreign to Jewish villages and Roman governance. There is also no certainty about how many there were. The account mentions 3 gifts, but does not specify the number of travelers. There could have been 2, 3, or more, but tradition adopted the number 3 in line with the enumerated gifts. Centuries later, names and appearances were assigned to them symbolizing different regions of the world, but none of this appears in the oldest accounts. What can be affirmed is that they belong to cultures with advanced development in celestial sciences and religious rituals. The journey from the east would not have been improvised. To cover hundreds of kilometers, cross territories under different jurisdictions, and reach a region controlled by Rome, preparation was necessary. Caravans usually advanced along secure routes, such as the so-called Royal Road or paths parallel to the Euphrates, depending on the starting point. They could traverse deserts following the positions of the stars, stop at established oases, and lodge in fortified caravans-arais. In their culture of origin, journeys motivated by celestial signs were not unusual. The sages of Persia and Babylonia observed the skies from terraces built specifically for this purpose, recorded movements that could take years to repeat, and debated their meaning. If astronomical tables suggested a particular alignment or the appearance of a new light, investigating its correlation with human events was considered reasonable. In Judea, their visit represented a mix of fascination and puzzlement. On one hand, it confirmed that something unusual had occurred. On the other, it implied that important information circulated outside the province before reaching local authorities. The symbolism of the gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh in biblical tradition. When the sages from the east finally arrived at the place where the child was, they brought with them 3 objects highly valued in the ancient world: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Although centuries later these gifts would be interpreted in various ways, in their original context they had concrete meanings, linked to trade, religion, and funerary customs of different peoples. Gold was without a doubt the most universally recognized. In the time of Jesus, this metal represented wealth, power, and economic stability. It was used as currency in many regions of the empire and beyond, and its possession indicated influence and prestige. Transporting gold on such a long journey implied considerable risk, so those who did it needed protection and resources. For a humble family like that of Joseph and Mary, receiving gold meant an exceptional asset capable of sustaining them for years, especially in unstable times. Frankincense, on the other hand, was a more specialized material. It came from resins obtained from trees growing mainly in southern Arabia, Somalia, and regions of the Horn of Africa. Its trade was part of ancestral routes crossing deserts and mountains. It was used in religious ceremonies, both pagan and Jewish, for its characteristic aroma when burned. Temples of different cultures used frankincense to accompany prayers and rituals, creating environments considered appropriate for contact with the divine. Myrrh, by contrast, was associated with more varied uses. It was also an aromatic resin, but employed differently, in perfumed oils, medicinal treatments, and especially in funerary processes. In Egypt, Judea, and other regional peoples, myrrh was mixed with oils to embalm bodies or prepare ointments used in hygiene and healing. Its aroma was strong and persistent, and its price depended on the quality and purity of the resin. It was a product as precious as it was scarce. For the Eastern sages, these objects had value beyond material wealth. They formed part of a shared cultural language across many regions of the Near East. When foreign delegations visited a ruler, it was common for them to bring gifts representative of their land: precious metals, spices, fine stones, or aromatic resins. It was not only courtesy but also a form of recognition and respect. Thus, when the Magi presented these gifts, they were acting according to the diplomatic customs of the time. Gold was well received in any court. Frankincense and myrrh, in contrast, spoke of distant regions, of trade routes connecting Arabia, Africa, and Asia. They were products only obtainable through long caravans transporting difficult-to-obtain goods. In this sense, the gifts were valuable not only for their material, but also for the commercial history they carried. From Joseph and Mary's perspective, these objects must have seemed astonishing. They were common in palaces, temples, and wealthy homes, but rare in rural villages. Gold could fund a journey, pay tributes, or secure provisions. Frankincense could be used as valuable barter in major markets. Myrrh had practical uses in personal care and could be sold in small quantities without losing value. In the context of the ancient world, perfumed gifts also had a practical dimension. They helped preserve certain products, scented rooms, treated wounds, or were used in domestic rituals. A small amount could last months. That is why the arrival of frankincense and myrrh represented not only an exotic gift but also a tool to face future needs. It is important to situate these objects within the trade routes crossing the Arabian Peninsula. From ancient times, camel caravans transported aromatic resins from southern Arabia to the Mediterranean. Merchants traveled hundreds of kilometers across deserts, guided by stars well known to the sages. The regions producing these resins were known for their natural wealth and the prestige of their products. Gold, though more common, also circulated along these routes. Herod the Great, his paranoia, reign, and reaction to the announcement of the Messiah. At the time of Jesus' birth, the territory of Judea was under the rule of a man whose presence dominated political and social life: Herod the Great. His name had been associated for decades with absolute power, grand constructions, and a constant climate of tension. For the inhabitants of Judea, Herod was not a distant ruler but a vigilant presence influencing life in every city, village, and family. His rise to the throne had not been easy. Coming from an Idumean family, he did not descend from the traditional line of Israelite kings. He gained power thanks to the decisive support of Rome, first from Mark Antony and then from Augustus. This connection made him a client king of the empire, obliged to maintain internal order and guarantee stability in a province where religious and political identity often caused tensions. Herod fulfilled this role skillfully, but also with a severity that made him feared even by his own close associates. Despite his origins outside the traditional line, he worked to earn legitimacy by building projects that impressed both Israel and Rome. His most famous works included the expansion of the Jerusalem Temple, a monumental endeavor requiring thousands of workers, the creation of the port city of Caesarea Maritima, fortresses such as Masada and Herodium, and palaces reflecting his taste for Hellenistic luxury. These constructions aimed to leave a lasting mark and demonstrate his power to those who questioned his right to reign. However, beneath the grandeur lay a deep fear of losing control. Herod lived surrounded by intrigues, suspicions, and real or imagined threats. According to various ancient accounts, he ordered the execution of several family members, including 3 of his children and 1 of his wives, convinced they were conspiring against him. News of failed coups, rumors of betrayal, and internal court tensions marked his reign from the start. It was in this climate of insecurity that the Eastern sages arrived in Jerusalem asking about the king who had been born. For a ruler used to controlling every detail of his kingdom, the mere idea of a possible competitor, even if a newborn, provoked concern. Even more so when those reporting the birth were foreign travelers trained in astronomy and symbolism, disciplines that often held political weight. The news caught him by surprise. There was no information in the court confirming the birth of any child of significance. The temple, the city, and its surroundings spoke of nothing of the sort. Nevertheless, Herod knew that rumors, once spread, could destabilize a people who held deep expectations for their future. Jewish identity included constant hope for political restoration, and if the population began to believe a promised leader had been born, his own authority was at risk. Herod immediately summoned local scripture experts, attempting to understand where the idea of such a significant birth had arisen. They pointed to ancient texts mentioning Bethlehem as the city of a future ruler. The reference matched what the Eastern sages claimed to have seen in the sky. Although Herod did not show concern openly, his internal reaction was clear. He needed to know more and control everything. He decided to meet with the sages privately. He wanted details: when the star had appeared, how far they had traveled, and what signs they had interpreted. It was an interrogation disguised as courtesy. As he listened, he calculated dates and possibilities, trying to determine the child's approximate age and the magnitude of the threat. In the end, he instructed them to go to Bethlehem, and once they found the child, return to inform him. He spoke calmly, even with apparent interest. But behind this instruction was a strategy: to confirm the exact location of the child without arousing suspicion. The encounter of the Magi with Herod and political manipulation. When the Eastern sages arrived in Jerusalem, the city was in full motion. The temple, expanded and beautified by Herod himself, attracted pilgrims from all over. The markets overflowed with merchants, the narrow streets filled with voices, and caravans coming from the north or the Jordan Valley mixed with Roman soldiers patrolling the area. Amid this bustle, the arrival of foreign travelers openly asking about the newborn king of the Jews could not go unnoticed. Questions quickly began to circulate. The Magi were not ordinary figures. Their clothing, accent, and entourage immediately set them apart. Jerusalem was used to visitors, but these men seemed to have a specific purpose and knowledge that did not come from local rumors, but from observations made far from Judea. For the population, this was a source of curiosity. For the authorities, a sign of alert. When the news reached Herod's palace, it soon caused unease. The king knew well the weight of prophecies and messianic expectations among the Jews. From time to time, rumors would arise about promised leaders, figures supposedly meant to restore ancient glory or free the people from foreign rule. Most of these rumors faded quickly, but any that gained traction could become a serious problem for a ruler whose authority had never been fully accepted by the population. Herod immediately summoned the Magi. He received them with the appearance of an interested host, though inwardly he analyzed every detail. He wanted to know exactly what they had seen when the star had appeared and what led them to think this phenomenon was related to the birth of a king. The travelers explained the astronomical observations they had made in their lands and how those signs coincided with ancient expectations related to Judea. Herod listened silently, measuring each word carefully. The information about Bethlehem, identified by local experts as the place mentioned in the scriptures, added a concrete element to the story. For Herod, it meant that the Magi were guided not by rumors, but by a combination of celestial signs and cultural interpretations that seemed to align. This made the news more dangerous. If foreign sages considered that an extraordinary child had been born in Judea, other peoples might think the same. Despite his concern, Herod did not show distress. He feigned surprise, interest, and courtesy. He invited the Magi to continue their search and asked that once they found the child, they return to inform him. His tone was polite, but the intention behind his words was clear. He needed to know who the child was, where he was, and how to neutralize any threat before it grew. The Magi accepted the request, having no reason to distrust it. From their perspective, the encounter with Herod was a natural step in their visit. They had arrived in the capital, consulted the authorities, and now could continue toward the place where they believed the child was. Leaving Jerusalem, the atmosphere changed. The city, with its mixture of religiosity, commerce, and Roman oversight, faded behind them. The road to Bethlehem was short, only a few kilometers south. As they descended the hills, the view of the holy city vanished, giving way to rural landscapes. Shepherds, fields, and small villages formed the typical scenery of the region. The Magi, following their observations and what they had learned in Jerusalem, advanced with the expectation that their search was nearing its end. They carried not only the gifts, but also the conviction that the signal they had seen in the east had a specific meaning. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, Herod waited. He had given clear instructions to his collaborators, albeit discreetly. He wanted information, any clue to identify the family who had received the foreign travelers. The court knew the king tolerated no threats, however minor. Every rumor in the city quickly reached the palace. Herod's reign was entering its final years. His health was poor, and his fears had intensified. The arrival of the Magi had a greater impact than the city could imagine. A weakened ruler, aware that stability depended on his ability to control the political narrative, could not allow the idea of a child destined to transform everything to emerge. The Magi, unknowingly, had sparked a silent political mechanism in the palace. The question they had posed in Jerusalem, "Where is the king who has been born?" resonated like a direct challenge in a kingdom where even words had to be carefully measured. On the way to Bethlehem, the Magi had no way of knowing that their innocent inquiry had set in motion a political device. They advanced toward a quiet village, guided by the observation of the sky and the conviction that they had interpreted its meaning correctly. Just a few kilometers behind remained Jerusalem, with a king waiting not out of devotion but for strategy. The adoration of the child, spiritual significance of the Magi's homage. When the wise men finally arrived in Bethlehem, the village was still a quiet place compared to Jerusalem. There were no Roman guards patrolling the streets, nor crowds entering and leaving the temple. Instead, the travelers found humble houses, shepherds moving among the nearby fields, and families engaged in their daily routines. Nothing in Bethlehem suggested that something extraordinary had occurred there. But the wise men were not seeking visible signs in the surroundings. They had arrived following a conviction born much earlier, under the sky of the east. The village houses were modest, built of light-colored stone with flat roofs and few interior spaces. The travelers walked through its narrow streets, observing everyday life: women grinding grain, children carrying water, men tending animals. After days of travel and uncertainty, they must have experienced a mixture of anxiety and expectation. They did not have an exact destination, only indications. But the indications were enough to bring them there. At some point, they managed to find the dwelling where the family stayed. It was not a palace or a prestigious house. It was a simple home, perhaps with a small inner courtyard and a main room where the family slept and worked. The wise men stopped in front of the entrance, aware that they had reached the end of a journey that had begun with a star that had altered their calculations and astronomical tables. The scene they found inside the house was simple: a mother, a father, and a small child. Nothing in the surroundings suggested nobility, although the visit of foreign travelers was itself an uncommon event for Bethlehem. The wise men, accustomed to courts and ceremonies, must have immediately noticed the modesty of the place, but that modesty did not prevent them from recognizing in that child the reason they had crossed deserts and mountains. Unlike the gestures typical of Eastern diplomacy, here there were no thrones or formal receptions. The family had no servants or assistants. It was a home like many others, where life was sustained through simple trades and daily routines. That contrast between what was expected and what was found did not cause disappointment in the Magi. On the contrary, it seemed to reinforce the uniqueness of the moment. They had followed a celestial sign to a place that had nothing majestic, as if the event they sought were deliberately hidden behind the normality of rural life. The wise men bowed, a gesture symbolizing respect toward someone whose importance they recognized, even if they did not yet fully understand it. It was not a solemn scene in the political sense of the ancient world, but it was charged with a sense of quiet and strangeness. In that small space, without witnesses or protocols, the homage that tradition would remember for centuries took place. It was then that they presented the three gifts. The gold shone on the clay or stone surface of the humble home, creating a clear contrast between the wealth of the visitor and the simplicity of the family. The incense released a scent unfamiliar to Bethlehem. The myrrh, contained in a small jar, carried with it the perfume of distant lands and trade routes that the couple had never traveled. Each object seemed to bring a fragment of the Eastern cultures from which the wise men came. Joseph and Mary must have received these gifts with surprise and restraint. It was uncommon for foreign travelers to visit humble families with such valuable offerings. In other circumstances, the presence of strangers bringing high-value objects could have generated distrust, but the atmosphere of that encounter seemed marked by a clear intention of respect. For the family, the gifts would have a practical value, though at that moment they might not fully comprehend it. The visit of the wise men may also have aroused curiosity among the neighbors. Bethlehem was a small village, and any unusual movement was quickly discussed. However, the account does not provide details about the community's reaction. It is possible that the visit went unnoticed outside the house, or that those who witnessed it did not understand its significance. In a village busy with its own problems and the flow of travelers due to the census, the arrival of some Easterners might not have attracted much attention. Inside the house, the Magi stayed long enough to deliver their gifts and show their recognition. No speeches, celebrations, or long explanations were recorded. Their journey had a clear purpose, and once accomplished, there was no reason to prolong the stay. Tradition suggests that this adoration was silent, almost ceremonial, marked by the sobriety of those who know they are witnessing something significant without the need for grandiose words. After the homage, the wise men must have considered returning to Jerusalem. Herod was waiting for them, or at least expecting news, but something changed their plans. Somehow they understood that they should not return to the palace. Herod was not seeking to pay tribute to anyone. He was seeking information that could be used to his advantage. The wise men, consciously or not aware of the dangers surrounding Judea, chose to take a different route, avoiding passing through Jerusalem. This decision marked the end of their journey. The route they took and the time it took to return to their lands is not mentioned. Like their arrival, their departure remained silent, leaving behind a humble home where a family still did not know that this encounter with foreigners would be one of the most remembered moments of their history. The wise men departed as they had come, guided by convictions born from their study of the sky and their reading of the world. With their departure, Bethlehem returned to its routine. The child, his mother, and Joseph remained there a little longer, while outside the village forces began to move that they had not yet perceived. The role of angels in the accounts of the birth of Jesus. In the accounts of the birth of Jesus, figures appear who for the ancient world represented the direct intervention of heaven in human affairs. Angels. They were not strange characters for the Jewish imagination of the first century. Tradition conceived them as messengers who transmitted instructions, warnings, or announcements on behalf of God. Their presence in the family and national stories of Israel was common, and their appearance did not generate astonishment in a people accustomed to interpreting life through a perspective where the visible and the invisible coexisted naturally. During the events surrounding the birth, these messengers carried out different roles. One of the best known was the announcement to Mary regarding the conception of the child. In her daily life in Nazareth, this episode must have been disconcerting. Tradition describes how the message arrived with the clarity of an instruction that would completely alter the course of her life. The account does not detail the exact surroundings, but it is possible to imagine a discreet scene, far from crowds, where a young woman receives news that defies any expectation of the time. In a world where women depended on the established social order to ensure their well-being, such an announcement not only had spiritual implications but also social and family-related ones. Tradition indicates that Mary accepted the message with serenity, but it does not explain how her immediate community reacted. Nazareth was a small village, and in small villages news travels quickly. However, the accounts focus on what Mary understood as a purpose that surpassed her, accompanied by the intervention of this messenger. Joseph also received an angelic message, although under different circumstances. After learning of Mary's pregnancy, he found himself in the middle of a personal and social dilemma. His intention, according to tradition, was to resolve the situation without exposing her publicly. It was then that it is described that during a dream an angel reassured him and instructed him to move forward without fear. Dreams had a special value in the mentality of the ancient Near East. They were considered spaces where the divine could communicate with human beings in a symbolic or direct way. The appearance of the angel in his dream would not have been interpreted by Joseph as a fantasy, but as a legitimate revelation. These types of experiences were recorded in the scriptures and in family stories, and those who received them usually took them seriously. For him, that message changed the course of his life. He accepted Mary, assumed responsibility for the child, and faced the reactions of the community with a confidence he did not have before. In another scene that is part of the same narrative cycle, the angels appear before a group of shepherds who were watching their flocks in the surroundings of Bethlehem. Pastoral life was a common reality in the region, especially in the hills that surrounded the village. The shepherds spent whole nights outdoors, protecting the sheep from predators and thieves. Their work was marked by exposure to the elements and constant vigilance. That they were chosen to receive a message of this type contrasts with the idea that the extraordinary occurs only in solemn spaces. In the midst of the darkness of the night, a luminous figure appeared to them and informed them that a child had been born in Bethlehem. The shepherds' initial reaction was fear, a common feeling before any unusual appearance in a rural context. However, the message reassured them, and the figure disappeared as suddenly as it had arrived. After this encounter, the shepherds went to the village to see the child, becoming the first visitors recorded in the narratives before the arrival of the wise men from the east. In these accounts, angels are not decorative figures nor elements added to beautify the story. They represent an ancient way of understanding the relationship between earthly events and decisions that seem to come from heaven. For a people whose identity was built from stories where the divine intervened in crucial moments of their history, the appearance of heavenly messengers was a narrative resource consistent with their way of interpreting the world. The message that the shepherds received led them to travel toward Bethlehem on a night when the village was probably silent except for the usual sounds of the countryside. When they arrived and saw the child, they found him in a humble environment, just as it had been announced. Their visit, although brief, became an episode that would later be remembered as part of the chain of events that surrounded the birth. The role of angels in these accounts also reflected the need to convey trust in a moment where the circumstances were unstable. A census ordered by a distant empire, a forced journey, an improvised birth, and the unexpected visit of foreigners created an environment of uncertainty. The angelic appearances acted as points of orientation within that chaos, as signs that what was happening made sense within a broader framework that the characters could not fully see. The flight into Egypt, historical and prophetic reasons for the Holy Family's exile. The tranquility that Joseph, Mary, and the child had found in Bethlehem did not last long. While the family tried to adapt to daily life, far from their home in Nazareth, something was brewing in Jerusalem. Herod, who had been waiting for the wise men to return in the hope of obtaining precise information, finally understood that they would not come back. The travelers had left Judea without informing him of anything. For him, this silence was not a neglect, but a direct sign of disobedience. What was alarming was the reason. If the wise men avoided returning, it had to be because they had discovered something he was not supposed to know. Herod reacted as he usually did when he felt threatened, quickly and violently. Without exact information, he clung to the only available data, the approximate time the wise men had mentioned regarding the appearance of the sign in the sky. From that calculation, he made a decision that would affect all the families of Bethlehem and its surroundings. His objective was simple and brutal: to eliminate any possible candidate who could fit the description of that child announced by foreign visitors. Before Herod's orders reached Bethlehem, the family had already received a warning. Joseph, who had always acted guided by what he understood as celestial signs, had a new dream in which he was told to leave immediately. It was not an ambiguous message. He had to take the child and Mary and leave Judea. The suggested destination was Egypt, a country that, although under Roman control, was not under Herod's direct authority. For Joseph, the instruction meant a sudden change of direction, an urgent journey to a foreign territory. The choice of Egypt was not arbitrary. For centuries, Jewish communities had settled there, especially in cities like Alexandria, which had a significant Jewish population. Many Jews traveled to Egypt for commerce, work, or temporary refuge. It was therefore a place where a family could survive without attracting too much attention. Moreover, geographically, Egypt was relatively close, southwest of Judea, following caravan routes and roads that crossed the Sinai Desert. The urgency of the journey immediately transformed the family's life. They had no time to plan or return first to Nazareth. They had to leave from Bethlehem, a village that could no longer offer safety. The decision to depart possibly occurred at night or in the early hours of the day when patrols and rumors could still be avoided. They took what they could carry and prepared to travel one of the most inhospitable routes of the Near East. The route to Egypt varied depending on the paths chosen. One option was to head southwest along the coastal strip where there were more traveled roads used by merchants and Roman officials. Another was to enter semi-desert regions, avoiding main routes to maintain a low profile. In both cases, the journey was long, probably several days or weeks, depending on resources, group speed, and weather conditions. Along the coast, small settlements and military stations offered temporary refuge, although they had to remain unnoticed to avoid suspicion. Caravans traveling to Egypt transported goods such as oil, wheat, resins, and fabrics. It was not unusual to encounter travelers of different origins, and among them, Joseph, Mary, and the child could blend in without difficulty. However, the fear of being identified or intercepted accompanied them along each stage of the journey. Meanwhile, in Bethlehem, events took a tragic turn. Herod's orders were executed with the precision of the decisions he made when cornered. The village, which had received travelers for the census, experienced moments of anguish when soldiers sent from Jerusalem began inspecting homes in search of young children. For the local families, this was not related to prophecies or celestial signs, but to the violence of the power that ruled the region. The silence with which Joseph's family left Bethlehem was essential. Had they stayed one more day, the outcome would probably have been different. Egypt, on the other hand, offered distance, anonymity, and the possibility of temporarily starting a new life amid its cultural diversity. The country was a crossroads of civilizations, with temples, markets, and communities of foreigners living under Roman authority. For Joseph and Mary, Egypt represented a place of transit, not a final destination. It was not home, but it was refuge. In cities populated by Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, and Jews, they could go unnoticed while waiting for news or signs indicating when to return. The Jewish population of Alexandria was one of the largest communities of the diaspora, with synagogues, merchants, artisans, and a complex social system. Whether the families stayed in that area or in a more rural region is unknown. The accounts do not specify where in Egypt they settled or how long they remained there. The family's exile reflects a common practice in times of oppression or persecution, seeking temporary safety outside the jurisdiction of the ruler who represented the threat. Egypt had been for centuries a destination for those fleeing the instability of Judea. Its roots were well established, its economy was strong, and its cities were familiar to those belonging to the Jewish world, as even a Greek translation of their sacred texts circulated widely among the Jews of the diaspora. In Egypt, the family would have faced challenges typical of living in a foreign land: language, customs, market dynamics, and finding work to support themselves. Joseph, as a craftsman, had skills he could offer in any city of the Eastern Mediterranean. Life in exile, though difficult, was possible as long as one had a trade and some adaptability. Time passed, and at some point Joseph received another message, similar to the previous ones. He was informed that Herod had died and that it was safe to return. That announcement marked the end of their stay in Egypt. Without causing a stir, without leaving a trace in official records, the family prepared to return to the territory where everything had begun. The return to Nazareth and the silence of Jesus' childhood in biblical sources. When Joseph learned that Herod had died, the possibility of returning to Judea opened for the first time since they had hurriedly left for Egypt. The news must have arrived as a relief, but also as a warning. Although the ruler who had forced their flight was no longer there, the region remained an unstable territory, divided among different authorities and marked by internal tensions that persisted beyond a single reign. Joseph evaluated the return route with the caution of someone who had already learned that political changes could alter a family's life in a matter of hours. With Herod's death, Rome distributed the territory among his sons. Archelaus took control of Judea, Samaria, and Edom, but his reputation was not much better than his father's. Various accounts describe his rule as harsh and unpredictable, with uprisings and repressions beginning in the first months. Upon learning who now governed the region, Joseph understood that returning to Bethlehem would mean exposing themselves again to the authority of a leader who followed in his father's footsteps in terms of severity and control. This uncertainty led him to make another decision. Instead of returning to Bethlehem, the family would go back to Galilee, where Nazareth offered a more discreet and less supervised environment. Galilee was not under the direct rule of Archelaus, but under the tetrarch Herod Antipas, who governed in a different style, more tolerated by the local population. The distance between Judea's centers of power and the Galilean villages made a quieter life possible, away from the political tensions concentrated in Jerusalem and its surroundings. This return marked a notable contrast with the hurried departure to Egypt. If on that occasion the family had left at night and unprepared, now they returned with some calm but equally attentive to what they might encounter along the way. The route from Egypt northward again took them through desert regions and coastal settlements. Once in Galilee, the landscape became more familiar: gentle hills, cultivated fields, and villages where life revolved around agricultural and artisanal work. Nazareth was a small place away from major urban centers. It was not a city of political or commercial importance. It consisted of families who had known each other for generations, homes built with local stone, and workshops where wood, stone, and regional crops were processed. Joseph could resume his trade there without drawing attention, and the family's presence would not arouse particular suspicion. The discretion that Nazareth offered was ideal for those who had lived under threat and needed stability. From the return onward, the ancient accounts fall silent. No details are preserved about the first years of the child in Nazareth or the family's routine. This silence is not unusual. Sources from the ancient world rarely recorded the childhood of people who did not hold political or military positions. Private life in villages fell outside official records, and only the extraordinary or public events reached written accounts. In this case, the childhood developed far from administrative centers and without events that the world considered worthy of mention. Jesus would have grown up like any first-century Galilean child in a household where the economy depended on manual labor. Carpentry was a trade that included much more than working wood. It involved making tools, repairing structures, handling stone, and contributing to the community's daily maintenance. Learning took place in the workshop, observing and practicing alongside the father or other men in the family. Life in Nazareth revolved around work, the synagogue, and the festivities of the Jewish calendar. Children learned early to recite passages from the scriptures and participated in meetings at the local synagogue. There, teachings were transmitted, ancient passages were discussed, and the cultural and religious identity of the people was maintained. Contact with Jerusalem was occasional, reserved for pilgrimages or important festivals. The rest of the time, life passed in the immediate village environment, where each family contributed to the collective economy through its trade. There are no accounts of miracles, extraordinary episodes, or interventions by celestial figures during these years. The only scene preserved in some versions appears when Jesus is 12 years old and travels with his family to Jerusalem, but outside of that episode, the story remains silent. It is likely that the child's life passed without events that drew attention beyond the inhabitants of Nazareth. As happened with thousands of Galilean children, his childhood was marked by learning a trade, religious practice, and close contact with a small community. This literary silence should not be confused with inactivity, but rather reflects the nature of the ancient world. Childhood stories were rarely preserved, especially when there were no family records or assigned chroniclers. Life was transmitted orally, and only episodes considered exceptional or decisive were recorded. In this case, Jesus' childhood remained in the private sphere, far from the accounts that documented his birth and the extraordinary events surrounding it. Nazareth, with its relative isolation and mixture of Jewish and Hellenistic cultures, offered the ideal setting for a child to grow up without being observed by authorities or foreign travelers. The village was off the main routes, but sufficiently connected for its inhabitants to travel to the markets of Sepphoris or other nearby towns when necessary. In that balance between isolation and occasional contact, the family found a space to rebuild their life after the years of uncertainty they had experienced. The difference between the accounts of Matthew and Luke on the birth. Over time, the details of Jesus' birth were transmitted in different ways, and these differences are reflected in the two best-known accounts we have, those of Matthew and Luke. Both describe the same central event, but they do so from different perspectives, with emphasis on particular details and narrative interests that respond to their own contexts. For the modern reader, this creates a story rich in nuances, where some scenes coincide, others diverge, and others complement each other like pieces of traditions that circulated separately before being fixed in writing. Luke situates the origin of the movement in a census decree ordered by Rome. His account begins with Joseph and Mary traveling from Nazareth to Bethlehem because of the census, an element that establishes a precise historical framework and shows how an administrative event of the empire caused the child to be born far from home. In this narrative, the attention falls on rural life, on the manger where he is laid, and on the visit of shepherds who, according to the same account, received a nighttime announcement while watching over their flocks. Luke places the event in the realm of the everyday, highlighting how a humble birth unfolds amid the consequences of the most powerful political mandate of the ancient world. For this evangelist, Bethlehem is a point of arrival, a destination the couple reaches by external obligation. After the birth, Luke mentions that the family fulfills religious prescriptions in Jerusalem and later returns directly to Nazareth. In his sequence, life passes between the travel routes and the domestic routine of the Galilean village. There is no mention of immediate political threats or foreign visitors. The story flows from the movement prompted by Rome to the peaceful return to everyday life. Matthew, on the other hand, constructs his account from a different angle. For him, the scene does not begin with a journey imposed by a census, but with the arrival of wise men from the east asking about the birth of a king. In Matthew, the family is already in Bethlehem when the wise men arrive, and the context takes on a different tone. Not an administrative record, but the tension generated by the news that unsettles Herod. The focus is on the clash between the expectations aroused by the foreign travelers and the political anxiety of the ruler of Judea. In this version, the star occupies a central place as a celestial sign interpreted by the wise men. The account progresses toward the encounter between the visitors and the child, marked by homage and the presentation of gifts. The story takes an abrupt turn when Herod, realizing the wise men will not return, orders the killing of the young children of Bethlehem. This episode appears only in Matthew and is the narrative element that drives the flight to Egypt. There, the family remains until Herod's death, at which point they decide to return, although avoiding Judea due to the rise of Archelaus. The final destination, as in Luke, is Nazareth. The two narratives do not directly contradict each other, but they show different paths to reach the same point. One focuses on the Roman context and the everyday life of villages, the other on the interaction between foreign figures and a violent ruler. Each preserves traditions that probably circulated independently before being incorporated into its written version. Luke presents a sequence marked by normality: journey, birth, visit of the shepherds, and return to Nazareth. Matthew introduces elements not present in the other account: the star, the wise men, Herod, and the exile. Differences also appear in the settings. In Luke, the manger is an essential part of the story, a symbol of improvisation due to the lack of lodging. In Matthew, the text speaks of a house, suggesting that the family was already settled in Bethlehem when the wise men arrived. It is possible that the two traditions are describing different moments: the initial stay in an improvised space and the later residence in a home before the flight. The narratives, not intending to be detailed chronological diaries, record what each community considered relevant to transmit. Another notable difference is the presence of secondary characters. Luke highlights the shepherds, figures associated with the rural life of Judea. Their appearance fits the setting he proposes: a humble birth known by those living near Bethlehem. Matthew, on the other hand, introduces foreign characters who represent distant cultures and astronomical knowledge that exceeds the Jewish world. Each account, by choosing its protagonists, offers a different framework for understanding the scene. The political emphasis also varies. In Luke, the only power mentioned is Rome, distant but influential, whose decree compels travel. In Matthew, the focus is on the local figure of Herod, whose reaction to the announcement of a possible king triggers the most dramatic events. Luke shows an empire that reorganizes territories without knowing it is causing a birth. Matthew presents a ruler who, fearing loss of control, takes extreme measures. Despite these differences, the two accounts agree on several essential points. The birth occurs in Bethlehem, the mother is Mary. Joseph guides the family through difficult decisions, and the place where Jesus grows up is Nazareth. Both share the idea that childhood passes in silence, without extraordinary episodes recorded during those years.